Okay, guys, so this video is meant to serve as a quick introduction to the blood. We're going to talk about the major components, which are the cells, the red blood cells, white blood cells, the platelets. Then we'll talk a little bit about the plasma, and we'll talk a little bit about how clotting actually takes place. It's only going to cover the first 2 pages, the front and back of the first page of that packet, and the rest we'll go over in class. All right, so let's jump right into it. All right, so the average person has about 10 pints of blood, which comes out to about 4.5 liters, someplace in that ballpark. But it varies a lot based on size. And so the average, generally the bigger your frame is, the more blood you're going to have. A lot of you guys have probably tried to donate blood, especially some of you guys that are a little bit smaller might have tried to donate blood and they don't let you. Well, if the average person is 10 pints and they donate a pint of blood, they're giving up about 1/10 of their blood. If you are much smaller than the average person, you might only have like 8.5 pints, 9 pints, and then that's too large a percentage. It'll cause too much of a drop in your blood pressure when you lose that blood, so they often don't let you. Blood is going to be made up of 4 main components. We've got our red blood cells, okay, our white blood cells, our platelets, and our plasma. We're going to talk about each of those in order here, and they're pretty straightforward. It's fairly easy. All right. So our red blood cells, which are also referred to as erythrocytes, that's a vocab word that you want to recognize. Okay, and their big job is they're going to transport. Okay, so transport gases. And when we talk about gas, most people focus on the oxygen, but they do transport carbon dioxide. We'll show you that, or actually we've already seen that in the respiratory system, right? So they transport gases throughout the body. Okay, they're typically bright red when they're filled with oxygen and more kind of purple when they're low in oxygen. You'll see the numbers here vary quite a bit. So notice this, guys: 4.6 to 6.2 million red blood cells per millimeter cubed. So we're talking about a drop. About a drop of blood has that many red blood cells, and in women it drops to there. So the lifespan for red blood cells is about 120 days. So just about, I usually like to round it out and say about 1% of your red blood cells die off every single day. It's a little less than that, but it works out pretty well in terms of understanding it. And so that's a tremendous number. If you've got, say, 5 million red blood cells per drop of blood, and then you start doing that math out, it's huge numbers of red blood cells that are being produced. Okay, and that process is called hematopoiesis. Okay, kind of a little bit of a mouthful there. Okay, but it typically occurs in the red bone marrow, right? Remember we saw yellow bone marrow earlier in the year with the cow tibia, and that's mostly fat that's filled the medullary cavity, not useful for making red blood cells. But the red bone marrow produces a lot, and it needs, in particular, these pieces, the folic acid, B12, and iron, are nutrients that are particularly important for that red blood cell production. So a couple other notes before we move on, guys. We've seen this before. Remember, we looked at the structure of a red blood cell. So remember, it's often described as this biconcave disc. So it's concave on this side, concave on that side. I usually describe it as looking like a jelly donut that somebody squeezed and squished in both sides. So the fingers here and finger there and kind of squeezing it in. Notice the size. I mean, it is tiny, guys. So this here is showing you a capillary, right? So this is a capillary. That's our smallest blood vessel. And notice that the red blood cells pretty much have to go through one at a time. They go through almost stacked, and they refer to it as a rouleau. Okay, but you get this stack of red blood cells that goes through. They have to really go through one piece at a time, and that's a important feature when we look at stuff. All right, we're going to see a few examples in class tomorrow, and actually get to see the different components here. But that's generally what we want to get out of the red blood cell portion. So let's move on now to the white blood cells. And the white blood cells have their own special name called leukocytes. And that leuko you'll recognize from leukemia and things like that. All white blood cells are specialized. They have different jobs, which we'll talk down here. We're not going to do a great job with white blood cells now. We're going to do more with them with the immune system. But we'll cover a couple of basic ideas here. But in general, they specialize in protecting the body from pathogens. Okay, and that's going to be our general word for anything that can kind of make you sick there, guys, so a pathogen. Okay, the neutrophils, I'm not going to have room to write this in because my pen's not that fine, so you guys are going to have to work at this. So the neutrophils and the monocytes are both phagocytes. Okay, so I can get... Okay, and remember, phagocytes refers to phagocytosis, so that's Phagocyte. I know the handwriting's hard there. And remember, that's phagocytosis, that's when the cell membrane kind of engulfs and swallows things up. Okay, and the neutrophils are better at smaller things, and the monocytes are the exact same thing. They're phagocytes, but they're a much larger cell, so they can handle much larger stuff. So bacteria, very easy this way. Larger multicellular stuff can be, or larger organisms can be handled by the monocytes. Okay. Now, when you look at the basophils, okay, the basophil is going to release a whole bunch of chemicals that cause inflammation, and they do some other stuff as well. But the one that's not on here that I want to add in is histamine. Almost fit it in there. So Histamine. Okay, and histamine and heparin both cause inflammation. That's an intentional part of our immune response. We'll talk more about that when we do the immune system as well, but it's something we intentionally do. Okay, the eosinophils here, they're going to focus more on parasites. Help in lots of different ways, but things like if you had like a tapeworm or something like that, that's more of their focus point. Okay, and then the lymphocytes are the ones that are going to make your antibodies. Okay, so they're going to make the antibodies, and the antibodies, we'll get into exactly their structure and that kind of stuff with the immune system as well. But they're really important. They're key. All right, normal white blood cell count. Look at the numbers here, guys. About 5 to 10,000 white blood cells per millimeter cube. That's the same volume. So white blood cells are 5,000 versus the red blood cells are 5 million. So your blood, when we talk about the cells, the vast majority of the cells are the red blood cells. The white blood cells are kind of interspersed amongst them. Okay, when you have a really high white blood cell count, that's usually referred to as leukocytosis, and when you have a low white blood cell count, that's usually referred to as leukopenia. And they could indicate different things. Leukocytosis, if you went and had your blood drawn and you had leukocytosis, it might indicate that you have some sort of ongoing infection you might not be aware of. Your white blood cell counts tend to go up when you have cancer, so that could be an indicator of something's going on there. And then leukopenia would be an indicator that you have a weakened immune system, that it's not going to do much in terms of defending your body that way. The next part down here, guys, are called the platelets, and they're the thrombocytes. That's their big fancy technical word. Okay, and they're huge incomplete cells that kind of float around as chunks of cells. And essentially, they get produced, but then as soon as they get produced and they try and squeeze through a capillary, they break apart. And I picture them almost like you drop like a dinner plate in your house, and you got the shards floating around. That's kind of what you're looking at. And what they do is they help control bleeding, right? So they help control bleeding. And they do that because they actually stick to connective tissue. Okay, so they stick to connective tissue, and that's a big part of how we form clots. So let's start by looking at this diagram over on the right here. Okay, so what this is a vial of blood that's been spun in a centrifuge, spun around really fast and separated by mostly by weight here. So you'll see down at the bottom you get your red blood cells. Okay, so there's our number again, red blood cells, all of this here. Okay. And then you have what's referred to as the buffy coat, and you'll get to see the buffy coat tomorrow, which is pretty cool. And the buffy coat is the white blood cells and the platelets. So you have this thin little stripe right here. And then the rest is going to be plasma. Okay, and the plasma is usually around half or 55% of the total volume, and that is the watery portion of your blood. So you'll notice it's mostly water. Okay, it's got some plasma proteins in there that we're going to talk about over here in a second, and it's also where you carry all your nutrients, your amino acids and your sugars, and you can kind of look at all that stuff, the hormones and the electrolytes, all those types of stuff in there. Okay, so we've talked about these pieces down here, and we're going to focus on the plasma. Okay, so again, plasma, mostly water, with the proteins and nutrients mixed in. Okay, and we're going to focus just on 3 of the proteins. There's a lot of other things going on, guys, but the 3 big proteins we want to talk about are your albumin, your globulin, and fibrinogen. Okay, so the albumin is really important in your water balance. It helps maintain the proper osmotic balance between the cells and the blood flowing by. And a few years back, my grandmother, her liver stopped producing this. And what happened was she started to collect fluid everywhere. Like her abdomen was filling with fluid all around the organs. Her legs were swelling to about 1.5 times the normal size. And they actually had to put like a drain into her abdominal wall and actually drain out all this fluid until they got it taken care of. It's also what you see going on when you see like starving children throughout the world, and you see like really skinny, emaciated arms, but then you also see that really distended stomach. Well, that stomach is not fat distended; it's distended with water, because when you have very poor areas, they often don't have enough protein. One of the proteins in their diet, and one of the proteins their body then doesn't make, is albumin, which messes up this water balance, and then they get a massive swelling of the abdomen. So what you're actually seeing in that case is not fat, it's just the abdomen like retaining water and swelling with water, almost like a water balloon. Okay. Second one you want to see on here is globulin. It's one of those things that kind of helps with cholesterol, helps transport lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins within the blood. And then fibrinogen is going to be really important in our blood coagulation, and that's just our big fancy word for clotting. So we're going to come back to that here in a second. All right? So those are your 3 big plasma proteins. And then the other components we've talked about a ton with the nutrition unit. So we'll kind of move on from there. Alright, so the last piece of this video, guys, has to do with hemostasis. Hemostasis, and it looks a lot like homeostasis. Please don't mess them up. So hemostasis is the stopping of bleeding. And generally what happens, the very first thing that happens when you damage a blood vessel and it starts to bleed is it's referred to as the blood vessel spasm. Alright, and when you get the blood vessel spasm, what you end up doing is you decrease the size of the hole. So imagine you slice open a blood vessel that's this big. When the smooth muscle around the wall constricts, it will make the opening, say, this big. And that's obviously going to decrease the amount of blood flowing out. It makes it easier to plug it up and clot it. Okay, so that's the very first thing that happens. Okay, so it's going to make the hole smaller. All right, and that's make the hole smaller idea. Okay, when there's a really small break, we don't need a clot. All we get is the platelets stick to it. So remember, in a blood vessel, you have epithelial tissue, which you'll see here, right? Epithelial tissue, and then you have a layer of connective tissue underneath, and platelets stick to the connective tissue. So as the blood starts to flow out, you'll actually get the platelets just kind of start sticking around the connective tissue. So you don't actually need a whole lot of clotting for really small stuff. It's just going to generally stick in those spots. So what results in that case is what we refer to. What we refer to in that case is called a platelet plug. Okay, so it's not really a clot. All it is platelets that kind of are kind of sticking in there. Okay. Now the picture over to the right, this is actually showing clotting. So I kind of probably shouldn't have drawn over there to start with. But when we have a larger break, we need to undergo coagulation, which is this right here. So that's what you want in that blank, coagulation. Okay, which is a big fancy word for blood clotting. Okay, and as you can kind of see in this picture, guys, coagulation is pretty complicated. You have lots of different chemicals. Each one of these things are different factors or chemicals or parts of the process. But what we really want to focus on is this section in blue. Okay. And what you'll see in here, guys, is you have a lot of stuff that converts this factor X into prothrombinase, and then the prothrombinase changes the prothrombin into thrombin. But this is the key. Here's your plasma protein, fibrinogen, that we've been talking about. And what you've got to do is convert that into fibrin. Okay. So the fibrinogen Sorry, I butchered that spelling there. Alright, so the program I'm recording with here isn't letting me erase that for whatever reason. So fibrinogen right here is what we're supposed to be putting in that top blank, okay? And it gets converted into fibrin. So fibrin should be in this bottom blank. And the fibrin forms this mesh over here. So you see all these strings that are over on this side here? That's what we're really getting. And those strings are made out of connective tissue. So as the blood flows out, the platelets stick to it, the red blood cells stick to it. It's almost like a net that catches all those things and ultimately forms a dam. I like to think of it almost like a beaver dam. If you've ever paid attention to like how beavers build things, they put a few sticks across, but as the water flows through, more sticks stick to it. So it's almost like the flowing creates the dam or the clot in this case. So that's what we wanted to get tonight. You've got the basics of the main components of the blood and what each of the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are responsible for, and a little bit of introduction to how clotting works. And we will come back to this tomorrow and give you a whole lot more detail. Have a good night.